This is my new friend. I've been using the GH5 for almost 2 months now. I used the GH4 for about 3 years. Actually, ever since it was released in 2014, I used the GH4 as my main camera for my YouTube videos, as well as my videography business, and I mainly do wedding videography on the side. So I wanted to do this video review of the GH5 and let you know from my perspective as a wedding videographer how well it works and how well it performs compared to the GH4 and whether or not you should get it. And this review is strictly talking about the video features and the video advantages of the GH5, not really about photography because I'm not a photographer just yet. So the GH5 is the next version up from the GH4, which came out in 2014, and right now the GH5 is at $1,997 and the GH4 is at $1,497, so there's a $500 price difference between the two. And I'll put the links to everything that I mentioned in this video, the cameras, lenses, all that stuff, in the description below for you to check out. Now let's quickly go over the similarities between the GH4 and the GH5. So they both have a micro Four Thirds sensor, they both shoot 4K video, they have features like focus peaking, they have built-in Wi-Fi with a compatible app, they have external mic jack, a headphone jack, and they also use the same battery. Now I will say quickly about the battery life. So from my experience with the GH5, it hasn't been that much better than the GH4 battery life. So you're going to get pretty much the same battery life that you get out of the GH4 if you've been using the GH4, if you're used to that kind of battery life. Now, it still is better than other cameras like Sony, for example. Sony battery life is still inferior to the GH5 battery life and the GH4 battery life. Now, I want to spend some time talking about the best new features and the best new advantages that the GH5 has over the GH4 from a filmmaker's perspective. So the first thing is obviously going to be video quality, and these are all the main features, the main new features that affect or improve video quality with the GH5. So the GH5 has a new sensor. It's a 20.3 megapixel sensor compared to the 16 megapixel sensor in the GH4. It doesn't have a low pass filter like the GH4 has, so you're going to end up with slightly finer details. It has a 1.7 times faster readout, so that's going to help reduce the rolling shutter. And the GH5 has a new image processor that can process data 1.3 times faster than the GH4. A new feature with the GH5 is that when you shoot 4K video, it has no cropping. So on the GH4, it cropped a little bit. The GH5, on the other hand, will utilize the full width of the sensor when it's recording 4K. So you're not going to get a crop, and it's going to be it's going to capture more light, and also it's going to help with the noise performance. Now, speaking of light capturing, low light performance, we all know that the micro Four Thirds sensors do not have great low light capabilities compared to the full sensor cameras like the Sony a7S II, for example. So the micro Four Thirds, it's not going to be a low light king. You know, I found in my experience, I think it comes down to the lens selection. For if you're a micro Four Thirds camera user, the lens selection is hugely important when it comes to low light performance. So definitely want to have some lenses that work well in low light. Now the ones that I use in low light, I have a Voigtlander 0.95, so it's very fast lens and it works really well in low light situations. The other one I use that's fairly cheap is the Lumix 25mm 1.7. You can get that for I think less than $300 or $200, especially if you get a used one. And then the third one I also use is the 42.5mm, the Lumix lens, the 1.7, which is also around the same price range as the 25mm, so it's fairly affordable. So those are my three go-to lenses when it comes to low light. And if you're shooting with other lenses, you want to know about the ISO performance. When I'm shooting, I try not to go over 3200. I try to actually keep it 1600 ISO and below when possible, but I will push it to 3200 if necessary. However, I do not feel comfortable going past 3200 ISO, even on the GH5. Now, some other cool new features of the GH5 when it comes to video is you can see the waveforms and the vector scopes of the scene being shot on your screen. So seeing those tools on the screen is pretty awesome. The GH5 also has a really cool feature when it comes to rack focusing. You can set 3 different points and automatically the camera will go from point to point and rack focus automatically, which is really cool. Now, one of the best things about the GH5 is the firmware. So the current firmware that I have loaded on, along with the upcoming firmware that's coming later this year or this summer, I think, it's going to give us a huge, impressive selection of high resolution formats, frame rates, and bit rates. Now with the GH4, you need some type of external recorder to get certain higher frame rates or better compression. Now with the GH5, it can do that internally. So for example, the GH5 can record 4K 422 10-bit at 150 megabits per second, which is awesome because that's double the color information and 64 times color depth in comparison to the internal recording of the GH4. But for me as a solo videographer, the best feature by far, I think, is the 4K at 60 frames per second. Because not only does it produce some stunning looking video, but it gives you so much flexibility in post, which we'll go over in just a minute. That is by far, I think, the best thing about the GH5. So let's talk about slow motion. The GH5 can now shoot 180 frames per second at full HD compared to 96 frames per second on the GH4. The way I use the GH5 with weddings and my YouTube videos, I haven't had the need to really use the 180 frames per second. I mean, you only use that in certain situations, very specific situations where you want to slow down something that's going really fast. So it hasn't really affected or improved the way that I shoot. However, like I just mentioned, the 4K at 60 frames per second is the biggest improvement that I've seen. I film in 4K and I deliver in full 1080p HD. The way I do it now is I record in 4K, and with this latest wedding that I shot, I think I recorded a lot of things, like most of the wedding video I filmed in 4K at 60 frames per second, and I just laid it on a 24 frames per second timeline. You may not like the look of that. Some people just don't like the look of that. However, I found that it doesn't really bother me as a filmmaker, and it doesn't really bother, or my brides and clients don't even really notice. So shooting at 4K 60 and editing on a 24 frames per second timeline, you can punch in with no quality loss, so you can kind of zoom in and take things out of the frame or slowly move a frame down. And I was able to do that with a GH4. I shot in 4K and kind of punched in on a 1080p timeline. However, the 60 frames per second allows me to not only punch in without quality loss, but slow the footage down to a 24 frames per second timeline, and it results in smooth slow motion. But if I don't want slow motion, I can just play it at a regular speed and it works fine. So now I have the flexibility to just have a shot that's in regular speed, normal speed, or slow motion. For weddings, that is huge because there are a few select moments during a wedding that just look so beautiful in slow motion, and the brides and the clients love those shots. So if you can have that flexibility to do that and just shoot 4K 60 for most of the day on one camera, that's pretty awesome. Stabilization is the next big improvement on the GH5, one of my favorite new improvements actually. The GH5 now has in-body image stabilization, and dual IS2 combines the IBIS with the optical IS that is on certain Lumix lenses. So if you have a Lumix lens that has OIS on it, that ends up to be a total of 5 stops of compensation for stabilization. That's a lot of Asians, right? The more Asians, the better, I think. So not only does it look awesome when you have lenses with the OIS, with the 5 stops of compensation, but also with lenses that don't have it. So for example, I love to use a speed booster with my Sigma 1835 lens. That's my go-to lens that stays on my GH5 90% of the time. Even with the in-body image stabilization on just with that, it allows me to shoot handheld with that lens, which I couldn't do before on the GH4. The GH4 was just too shaky. Now with the GH5, with the in-body image stabilization, it is huge. It's a huge improvement because I can handhold it, and if I do it just right, I have a pretty smooth shot that can mimic a slider shot. Like I said, when I shoot in 4K 60 frames per second, that helps out a lot with the shakiness as well. So if I'm shooting at 4K 60 and I slow it down to 24, I can get a nice smooth shot without an OIS lens, and allows me to use my favorite lens. So that is huge. That is by far one of the best benefits of the GH5. Now moving on to one of the most popular topics about the GH5, the autofocus. So there was a lot of videos that came out right as the GH5 was released about how bad the autofocus is. Some people said, oh no, you're just not using the right way. I found that, I never used autofocus on the GH4 as far as video, continuous autofocus in video mode. And I don't plan on using it on GH5, but I tested it out. It's not that great. It's probably about the same as the GH4, even though the GH5 has an improved algorithm. It has 225 autofocus points compared to the 49 on the GH4. And it even has customizable autofocus settings within the camera now. However, I just don't feel like it is up to par. I don't trust it. I don't rely on it when I'm actually using it for professional use. I never have used autofocus in the past. Now, I know that a lot of people will like to use autofocus on gimbals, and it does work if you are actually, you lock onto the subject first and you do it in really well lit situations. It can't be low light, and don't do it for too long because it's going to hunt at some point. The way I use autofocus in video mode is I half press the shutter button and it focuses on the subject, and then I record. That's how I use it, and that's how I think most of everybody else uses it too. But if you're the type of person who really prioritizes autofocus on video mode, then go with a Canon 80D. or something like the Sony a6500. I think those would be the two best options for autofocus right now. So let's talk about some of the main differences in the design of the GH5. So the GH5 doesn't have a built-in flash on top like the GH4 did, so it's kind of more like a video camera now than a hybrid like the GH4 was. So if you're a filmmaker, that is probably good news. It has dual SD card slots. That is one of the best new features of the GH5. It can hold 2 cards and it can automatically switch from one card to the other when the other card gets full without skipping a beat in recording, which is pretty awesome when you're filming weddings. It has a full HDMI slot, which is nice. They moved the record button from the back up to the top, which I'm honestly not a huge fan of. However, I do like the new joystick that's on the back. It helps quickly go through settings, and it also helps with autofocus when you're setting an autofocus point. The new custom button near the lens was kind of weird at first. I pressed it a few times, didn't know that it was even there. But it's actually nice too, because I think I followed Griffin Hammond's advice and set it to the stabilizer. The GH5 now has Bluetooth built into it, which I thought the GH4 had, but apparently not. So the GH5 has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. The screen has more dots, so you're going to end up with a little bit better accuracy on the screen when you're looking at it, and it's actually brighter, so it helps out in sunny situations. And it's slightly bigger, so that helps out if you use the screen a lot, which I do. Another cool new feature about the GH5, which some people forget about, is that it has auto ISO in video mode now, so you can set it to auto ISO, which actually helps out a lot if you're vlogging and you set it to probably aperture priority mode along with auto ISO. And one of the new features that I absolutely love is the My Menu feature. So you can customize your own menu. So if you have certain settings that you want quick access to that you commonly use and commonly change, you can add them to your My Menu, and then you can just have them right there, and you just go to My Menu, change them right there, and it lets you be more efficient in changing your settings when you're running and gunning. So those are all the main features and new improvements that the GH5 has when it comes to filmmaking. It has now become my main camera for YouTube videos and my wedding videography business. Now the question is for you, since you've watched this video this long, that means you are very interested in it and you are really considering buying it. So that means you are okay with having a micro four thirds sensor, so you understand that it's not the best in low light situations. However, it still is good. It's not like it's not usable in low light situations. I use this all the time. I've never had anybody complain about noise or anything like that. It's just you have to have lenses to compensate for that. So you're not going to have a full frame sensor to capture all that light. The GH5 is, I think, in my opinion, the best micro four thirds sensor camera and one of the best video cameras with all the features that it has, all the internal recording formats that it has, 4K at 60 frames per second, the slow motion, the in-body image stabilization, and it's very easy to use and very easy to learn. So if you actually sit down and try to learn it and master it, it will become one of the most user-friendly cameras that you've ever used, and you will quickly be able to shoot high quality videos with it, no problem whatsoever. I think for all the new features and all of the abilities it has given me to improve my videos, that's really what it comes down to. The features that the camera has, is it going to help you be more efficient in some way? Is it going to result in higher quality films? Then yes, it is worth it. It is worth it for me. I love it. It is my main camera. It will be my main camera going forward for the foreseeable future. I hope you enjoyed this review. If you are interested in the GH5 or the GH4, I will leave links to them in the description below, along with all the links to the lenses and stuff that I mentioned in the video. If you want to check out my wedding videos, I'll leave a link to my website down below in the description below, so check that out. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. My name is Andy, and I will talk to you guys in the next one.